All right, well, let's get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Finance Committee meeting for the Radnor Township School District for Tuesday, June 20th, 2017. Before we get started, are there any introductions, remarks, follow-up?
I just have a couple of follow-ups. I think I answered most of the budget questions that were asked previous, with the exception of just a couple. There was one question regarding facility rental applications and why we don't do them electronically. We're currently looking into that, and we're going to be discussing that more at the Facilities Committee following this meeting. Also, there was a question regarding how many buses we were going to be buying for the $251,000 that's in the capital plan. We just opened those bus bids, and we anticipate that on the June agenda, there will be a resolution to approve one wheelchair bus and two 73-passenger propane buses. The wheelchair bus is also propane. While that does exceed the amount of the $251,000, the district intends to sell the buses that we're currently getting rid of, and we anticipate that that will bring in enough revenue to get us below the 100 and the 251. And that's it.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there any public comment? Hello, Ms. Sherry.
Judy Sherry, Governor Circle, Newtown Square. According to the Policy Committee meeting minutes from May 2nd, when there was a discussion of field trips and AR action, the goal of developing guidelines for funding field trips has been brought to the Finance Committee for review. And I'm wondering when the discussion will occur regarding these guidelines, and have they been developed at this point?
I don't think we can answer that question. We haven't set that one out, but we can get that on an upcoming agenda.
Okay, good. As I said, I took that right from the Policy Committee meeting. Regarding today's agenda, as a strong proponent for the Citizens Advisory Committee, I still would like to know if they publish meeting dates and are meeting in the public. And finally, about substitute teaching. We've gotten throughout the year some very good data on substitute teaching. I'm wondering how it will be used to improve the teaching in the future. And this year, a number of the charts showed a significant increase in teacher absenteeism. I did mention that in a prior meeting, I think. And I'm not sure that I heard an explanation as to why we think that that's occurring. Why do we have so many more teachers absent this year? And if the district has any suggestions on incentivizing teachers to show up. So, and finally, my final question about that is that on the chart, you'll see how many teachers have been absent, but then there are the number of substitutes required. So apparently, which I think Dr. Winters brought up, there are some teachers that do not need to have a substitute, and I'm wondering what's the criteria for those teachers? How do we determine that some teachers need a substitute and some teachers do not? Thank you.
Thank you. I think a couple of those questions we have brought up a couple of times. Is Todd going to be joining us today?
Todd is going to be joining us. He's going to be late.
Okay.
Tonight is the meeting for the Healthcare Trust.
Oh, yeah, fine. Okay, so hopefully if he's here, we can see what his perspective is. I know that we were evaluating what we thought the core reasons might be why the numbers were higher this year. I don't think they had resolution to that specifically, so.
Yeah, there were the thing about not needing a sub. I've asked that question before, and I believe the answer, and I can be corrected if I'm wrong, but I do believe that the answer is certain teachers are able to cover from inside the department for a period of time that the other class requires coverage. So in other words, somebody in-house is able to slide over and take the class for the missing teacher, and that ends up an internally managed thing is considered a sub not needed, Or in the case of a homeroom or a study hall, the kids can go to the library, sub not needed.
So, but that one I would think would be one of those curriculum questions, and you're already
Yeah.
going to have substitute discussion in a future
Right.
topic for curriculum.
Right.
Okay, so we'll see if we can get some of the answers for the sub question, and the updates the board had asked for. Any other public comment? Moving on. Okay, with regards to meeting minutes, Susan's pointed out just a couple of typos that need to be addressed up in that top section. Like just in the attendance section, very last sentence should say, the second word should be the, and instead of 6 member of the public, it should be 6 members of the public. With those changes, does anybody have any other concerns about the meeting notes? If not, brilliant. Then we'll move those on, and we can get to agenda item number 1. We've got some guests in the back of the room, PFM and RBC.
Yeah, can I just say, I actually had to contact Michelle. I had no idea what that meant.
Oh, sorry.
So next time, can we not do initials?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
That's
And
my fault.
No, I mean, and I had no idea what they, and I'm still not even sure. You told me what we're doing, but
It's a dentist.
So today we have with us.
you know that.
No, I know, because it's here.
Got it.
Today we have Jim Gray with us, Mike Lilly's with us, and Zach Williard. And we're going to talk about the 2 bonds that the district has that are variable rate that we've had for a long period of time. And I'll turn it over to these gentlemen. They can explain it much better than I do. You should all have a handout, and there are some handouts on the table if you didn't get one.
Sure, thank you. So again, I'm Zach Williard. I'm from PFM. PFM stands for Public Financial Management. We're the independent financial advisor for the school district and have been for a long time. And then RBC is RBC Capital Markets, the district's bond underwriter. So those are the 2 groups, okay? And we're going to walk through this yellow handout real quick. I think the last time we saw all of you was back in July of 2015. If you recall, we had a very successful, it was a 6-step refinancing plan. It saved about $9.2 million. So we were very proud of that, so I just thought I'd mention that again because it did work out really well. It's still an office record. So.
Oh, there you go.
So page 1, an interest rate chart. We always like to show you this. Now, if you look at this chart, this is the 10-year MMD. It's similar to the 10-year Treasury, but it's the tax-exempt version, so it's a benchmark in the municipal world. And the bottom line is, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, we're approaching all-time historic lows again for fixed interest rates, okay? And the point of the discussion tonight, as Michelle said, is the district does have one outstanding loan that's floating at a variable rate of interest. It's outstanding in the amount of about $15 million. So if we flip to page 2, we'll just kind of walk through some of these bullet points that give you the high-level overview of what we wanted to talk about. Now, this floating note that you've had since 2000 has performed very, very good. It has saved the district millions of dollars in interest expense since then. So it's worked out great, okay? Now, we've always talked about, whether it was publicly or with the business office, at some point in the future, there may be a time when it makes sense to change that variable rate mode into a fixed rate, okay? Right now, we wanted to bring this to your attention because it's starting to look like it might be that time. So if you look at the first bullet point, again, it just kind of goes over what I said. Now, the under B there, I think the important point to note is, now your note tracks an index called SIFMA, which will mean nothing to you. It's a tax-exempt index, okay? But what will mean something to you is that index tracks the Fed funds rate. So if you recall, just last week, they raised the interest rate by 0.25%. Okay, we're going to show you a chart on the next page. They've translated, and I think we have a bullet point that it says this, that there's going to be a number of rate hikes in the future. So, they're kind of telling us that this is going to happen, and it gives a nice opportunity for the district to act on this before you start to move higher on those interest rates. And then under C there, again, as I said, since 2000, the rate has been averaged below 2%, which is fantastic. It's worked great. The district did the right thing, saved a lot of money. And again, the question is now the time to potentially fix out that interest rate? The goals of the refinancing plan, I think we just kind of talked about that. It's really just to educate you all. That's our job on the pros and cons of doing this. And if you'd like to move forward, we can kind of talk about what the next step might be. And then under number 3, if we do decide that it's time to do something, there's probably 3 avenues that we would explore. Now, the most likely and most common and kind of plain vanilla way is to issue fixed rate bonds. So that's every other piece of debt in the district's portfolio is a fixed rate publicly offered bond issue. And that's the most common way to finance things in Pennsylvania for school districts. There under B, the Del Val Regional Finance Authority. Now that's the note that you have now that's floating, that is with Del Val, okay? So we can talk to them also. They have methods of turning variable rate debt that they have into fixed rate. So that's an option 2. You can see there, though, probably would be with the use of an interest rate swap. So we just have to tell you all that. But that is an option 2. And then finally, a local bank loan may be an option. Now, this transaction is about 11 years long, and some local banks, for a $15 million size loan that goes out 11 years, might have trouble offering a fixed rate for that. And if we're talking about the whole point of doing this is to swap, or to get out of a variable rate into a fixed rate, that might kind of defeat the purpose. But we just, we can explore that option for you.
Why 11 years?
Because that's the final maturity on the debt as it stands now.
Oh, and we have to have it paid off by then.
Right. Well, you will pay it off by then. The amortization schedule that you have now,
It's 11 more
it's like
years.
having, you had a 20-year mortgage, but now there's 11 years left, essentially. So I'll let Mike here talk about the next page.
So the three points we really wanted to make on this page. Oh, sorry. Thank you. The 3 bullet points at the top we're going to talk about, and they relate to the graph. The first thing we thought you might be interested in seeing is how, Zach mentioned a little while ago that it was a great decision to go with a variable rate back in 2000. Well, we wanted to show you how great a decision it was. Zach had mentioned you saved several $1 million. So one thing we wanted to show you is the difference in rates between if you'd gone a fixed rate and a variable rate. And if you go down to the graph, you see that horizontal line. That's tracking just about a 5.6% rate. That's when we went back and looked where rates were back then. That's what we estimated you would have locked in at a fixed rate. Then down below that, one of the lines that's being plotted there is the dark blue line. That represents the rates on the your Del Val loan. It's an estimate. It's not exactly the same, but based on our understanding of their pool and how that rate is constructed, we think we're pretty close. And you can see that the rate, the whole time that the issue's been outstanding, the rate has been below what you could have borrowed a fixed rate, except for one time. You see that spike up,
Yeah. What's
and that was the financial crisis when that
okay.
hit. Yeah,
Went
and,
that high?
yeah, it was pretty scary at that time.
Yeah, okay.
But other than that, it's been below that. And then, with that being said, if you would go down to the bottom of the page there, we thought you might like to see what the difference in rate actually was on an average basis. And we have one heading there, the weighted average interest rate. So for the 2000 Del Val note, it was average 1.94%. And, if you compare that to the 558, which was the exact number we estimated, it's over a 3.5% savings, which is pretty significant. And then when you translate it down into dollars, it's over $9 million in savings. So it was like, so we mentioned to Michelle, it was like a grand slam home run.
Well,
Second thing we want to mention is that, and Zach alluded to this earlier, is that, and this is going to be very important, I think, as far as whether or not you decide you want to go forward and fix the rate on this issue, is that we wanted to show you how the federal funds rate, that's the rate that the Fed adjusts, like it adjusted last week, how that tracks with the Del Val rate. And, we just talked about the Del Val rate, which is in blue, and the Fed funds rate is in red there. You can see since 2000, the Fed was tightening, rates went down for the early 2000s, and then they decided to tighten up their rate policy, and they raised rates all the way to just about in 2008 when the financial crisis hit. And you can see, during that time, they both tracked pretty close. And then as they lowered their rates because, it was a pretty scary situation. So you can see how the fast they dropped their Fed funds rate, and again, the Del Valle rate tracked with it. And then beginning you can see in the 2008 there where the Fed funds rate bottoms out. That rate has been there. They bottomed out as low as they could really make the rate, and it's been at that quarter of a point for a few years. And then in 2015, as you probably know, they started raising rates. And since they decided to raise rates at the end of 2015, they've raised it 4 times, a quarter of a point each time. And you can actually see that to the far right of the graph there. You see those steps in red. And then just above that, you can see the Del Valle rate basically tracking that above it. Since about 2008, the difference between your Del Valle rate and the Fed funds rate has been somewhere in the neighborhood of about a half a point, a little less than a half a point above that. Now, with that Fed funds rate right now is at 1.25%. And you can see that in a little box. It's in red right above where the end of we're plotting the rates there. The Del Valle rate was last 1.5%. We're showing there in the blue. But we really anticipate next week, or actually this week on Wednesday when they reset the rate, that it's going to increase because the Fed funds rate increase. And we're anticipating it's probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.75 or a little less than that. Again, about a half a point above where the Del Valle rate is, or where the Fed funds rate is. And we're also noting there in that box in green, that's where we're estimating the rate would be if you did a fixed rate refunding with a bond issue of this Del Valle loan. You can see what our concern is that, and it may be your concern too, is that as this rate's been going up, it's getting closer to where a fixed rate is. The third bullet point on top that we thought was important to mention is what the Fed has said they're going to do going forward. And you've probably read or heard that they're anticipating raising the Fed funds rate 4 more times, 1 before the end of this year and 3 more times in 2018. And if they were to do that, and they raised it by a quarter of a point each time, we would anticipate that rate would be at a 2.25%. And if you use the same spread that we've been seeing for several years between that and the Fed, between the Del Valle rate and the Fed funds rate, about half a point higher than that is 2.75. And what's pretty significant about that is that rate would be above where you could lock in a rate based on current market conditions right now.
So so it seems like it's kind of all converging here. A fixed rate right now, based on your current amortization, would be about a 2.34, and potentially by the end of 2018 or mid 2018, you could be at or above that on a variable rate basis. So is now the time to do this? That's the question. On page 4, this is the debt summary we show you each time we're here. We're talking about column 2 and column 15, which is highlighted in yellow there on the far left. So you can see that's what's left of the debt. Now this assumes a rate of, I think, of about a 2.25, and there's currently $15 million on this. And I also want to point out that it's currently callable at any time, so you have the ability to refinance it whenever you want, which is a nice feature of that. And then the last thing I'll point out on this page is in columns 18 and 19, your 2012 and 2013 bonds. And I apologize for the small font. If you go to the very bottom there, those have call dates. If you remember, the call dates on all your fixed rate bond issues are the first date in which you can start to refinance them. So, we will be in touch with Michelle and the business office to monitor those. Now, they were issued at very low fixed rates, so the ability to save $9 million again is not going to be there. But again, we'll kind of keep them on the radar screen and update you as we move forward and closer to those dates. And then, so the last page, page 5, that we want to talk about, we have 2 scenarios, the blue and the red. And what this scenario is designed to show you is, let's assume that right now in your budget you have the Del Valle at a 2.25% for the remaining 11 years. Okay, so that means that your variable rate stays even at 2.25% for the next 11 years. That's column 4. That's what we're showing you in column 4. Okay. Column 5 is showing you what happens if we went out today in the market and issued fixed rate bonds to refinance that $15 million floating rate based on a budget of 2.25%. Well, in column 6, you can see there'd be a cost to the district's budget somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year. Okay? Now, that's not that bad considering the chances of the variable rate staying at 2.25%, well, we know it's 0 because it'll go up and down. It could potentially be lower. If you have the view that over the next 11 years rates will go lower than where they are now, then you might not want to do this. But if you have the view that interest rates are going to, continue higher, kind of per what the Fed's telling us, well then, this is something to consider. And now, if you understand that scenario, let's just hop to the red and the right, and this is kind of a little sensitivity analysis. So in this scenario, same set of facts, except in column 7, instead of being budgeted at a 225, we're assuming it's a 0.5% higher at a 275 for the next 11 years, which also could be a fairly rosy view. But again, we just wanted to show it to you for illustrative purposes so you can see, how touchy this is. So if you're at a 275 all the way out till the final maturity in 2029, over in column 9, you can see if you went and did fixed rate bonds today, you'd save the district somewhere to the tune of, between $50,000 and $10,000 a year, which adds up to about $380,000. Now, if rates were to go higher to 3.5, a couple years from now, all these numbers will continue to multiply the higher the variable rate loan goes.
What are you estimating that a refinance rate would be, fixed rate?
Right now, about a 234.
A 2.34.
Yeah.
Okay.
So column 5 and column 8 are both assuming 2.34?
Correct.
Thank you.
Now that number, as you remember from all the refinancings, that number is going to change tomorrow, the next day, the next day. But as long as we stay within, kind of a range of where we are now, it could be a beneficial move. So with that, I think we're happy to take questions. We don't want to take up too much of your time here.
I really only just have 2 questions. One, the first is, of the 3 options that you outlined on page 2, what would you estimate the associated costs, whether it's points or, this, that, and the other thing? What would you assume the associated costs in a refi to be? Are they dramatically different between those 3 options? That's the first question. And then the second question is, what if we say, yes, we think this is a good idea, and then the board approves it as a good idea at the end of June, in what ways are we obliged or not obliged to move forward if either A, market conditions were to all of a sudden change, even though we don't expect that, or 2, will you have what would you need from us to have the flexibility that, say a fixed rate drops even lower than 2.34, or you just see a really good rate and you want to grab it that day, what would you need from us?
Good questions.
We normally provide them parameters.
So how does that all?
Right. So that's the answer to question 2, but we'll do one first. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but just a ballpark, and that the issuance costs would be built into those numbers we showed you in the back for the bond issue.
You built those in.
Correct. So the numbers that we showed you in the back would be net of some estimated issuance costs. Let's say those are probably, $125,000 or $150,000 for the $15 million issue. Okay. For the Del Val, might be half of that, maybe a little more than half of that, and same with the bank loan. I think would be fair ballpark answers. These are ballpark because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yeah. But again, if you remember, all the numbers that we ever show you when we come here are always net of everything. They're net of state reimbursement, because if you remember, you get state reimbursement on all your debt,
Sure.
or most of it, and then always net of any associated costs along with that. So if we were to come back with some more analysis, everything would always be net. The second question is, in fact, the parameters resolution. If you recall, back in July of 14 when we set up that 6-step plan, we actually did all of that kind of on day 1. And the way the parameters was set up was it allowed for the financing team to do all these different scenarios, just as you said, depending on how interest rates move. Because that whole plan took about a full fiscal year to execute. It was July of 14 to May of 15.
Yeah.
And we kind of diced and did all this neat stuff in order to save you the most money. I think we would want to do the same thing here. Is if we're going to move forward with something, what we'll want to do is come back to, I'm making it up, but we'll come back to your July or your August meeting or whenever it is, we would pass a parameters resolution, okay? And if by the time we get that done and we get the credit rating back, if interest rates are still where we want them to be, we can go execute. If interest rates move away from us, or there's some reason we want to back off for a minute, we have the ability to do that without really stopping the process because we'll still have all the paperwork done.
But typically, the parameters resolution would pick a path here. We wouldn't be saying a parameters resolution that could say any of these three.
No, we would want to
We would pick a path, get the boundaries around the path, and then,
It would be, yeah, it's a lot easier and cleaner if we can hone in on A, B, or C before we take that next step. And I think you also said, are you obligated to do anything? No, you're never obligated to do anything.
So, I guess one last follow-up now that you answered A, B, and C. Given that the issuance costs are higher with option A, what's the benefit to A over B and C?
Sure.
Well, you already told us why not, potentially not C, so that one you answered. Really, the question is, why not just convert in B if the issuance costs are lower?
Sure, so the issuance costs are always one part of the equation. Typically, the more important part, especially when you're talking about a $15 million loan,
Where's the rate?
is the interest rate. So, if we can get better fixed interest rates via a bond issue, that could potentially, outweigh the issuance cost problem by many, many times.
Okay.
So I think that's typically.
so do you then act as our agent in contacting Del Val to work through what packages they would have available to us?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
So we can contact Del Val, they'll explain all their options as far as converting to a fixed rate. And again, then we can report back as far as the pros and cons of kind of the different scenarios.
Do you guys have any questions? over
Should
here?
we have done this 6 months ago? To a year ago?
Well, I guess 6 months ago would have been kind of in the midst
Bottom.
of the
Yeah.
interest
Election.
rate rise, right? But the lowest point in history was last July, and we're getting awful close to it. So the current rate right now is about a 184. The average, I'm looking at that box on page 1, is a 261. So we're almost a percent below the average just of the last 10 years. And as we all know, the last 10 years itself was even skewed because rates have basically been going down. So, yeah, without the crystal ball at hand, this is as good a time as any to talk about this.
Okay.
The year ago was the election, so.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on. So, do you guys have any other questions per se? I'm
I
sorry.
was just going to add just one thing, is that one of the reasons that maybe it's more of a motivating factor to look at this now is the Fed's raised their rates 4 times now, and that's,
Serious.
yeah, so now we know that,
Well,
they're pretty
especially
serious
compared
about
to
it.
the period that they did nothing.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly,
exactly.
so that's kind of why we thought now it might make sense.
No, I think it's
Yeah, and they're
a
saying
good
they're gonna
idea
do it,
for
which
us.
before they never have. I mean,
Yeah, I
for the
know,
last
it's
10
great.
years, they've actually telling you what they're gonna do, which is, for the
It
last
used to
10
be that
years.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But just for clarity,
Yeah.
none of the other bonds, I'm trying to find that page and read it.
Page 4?
They're not, nothing's.
There's nothing else that's,
No,
No, so all the other ones are
or in
fixed,
18.
yeah,
and they're all at very low rates.
they are. Okay, all right,
Yeah,
so.
6 months ago, nobody knew what,
my
the
thought
bond market,
would
I
be-
mean, I do finance, but 6 months ago, just nobody knew what was gonna happen, so everybody was hedging everything.
I would
So
think
that
of-
wouldn't have been a good time either, because, I mean, I know people that lost, bet the wrong way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean.
I was just going to say, it would make sense to me, and I guess I would make the suggestion and ask if everybody's in agreement. If you guys want to go off and have that conversation with Del Val and find out, do the exploratory work on that
Sure.
path and see what options we have available to us, and then come back and we can talk about it. If you do that, though, then I know that it's a boatload of work to put together the parameters resolution and everything around it, but could you at least bring back some framework around what a fixed rate bond plan would look like in it, plus whatever Del Val has, and then we can make some decisions.
The only other question I have is, we don't have a finance meeting in July. Do you feel comfortable that it's effectively coming back in 2 months to give us that information? Are we going to potentially miss
Yeah,
the boat?
we only want to move as fast or as slow as you want us to move,
Okay,
so.
yeah, I guess that's more a question for you guys. 2
Why don't
months.
we say this? Why don't you guys take a look at what the options might be?
I mean,
And
we're
then
also happy if we can-
if we're feeling, if there's signals out there that say it's more urgent, we can always call a committee meeting
Right.
to discuss one topic.
Do you know who you would approach for the bank loan option? Is there anybody out there?
Yeah, and we can talk to Michelle about, deposit bank but yeah, there's a few options.
Like you said, that one's probably likely to fall off the table pretty quickly, but it's an option.
You never know. You never know.
an option.
You never know.
Okay,
As long as they fund it, they might
Right.
like it.
I hear you. All right, so we good? You
Okay.
guys good?
We're good.
Yeah,
So
excellent.
I'll
Very
work,
good.
I'll work with Zach and Mike and Jim, and we'll put some things together. If we feel that we need to come back to you to have you pull together a meeting, I'll be in touch.
Yeah, we can do that.
Otherwise, we will have these gentlemen back for our August meeting.
Excellent,
great.
thanks.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
That's all right, we'll find out later.
Thanks for putting us on front. We
Yep.
appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
16-17 fiscal year end.
I just wanted to remind everyone that we're rapidly approaching the end of the 16-17 fiscal year end. It is June 30th. We've got some last-minute things that we've been trying to close out here in the last 2 weeks. The auditors are scheduled and will be on site. We have the 17-18 fiscal year open, and buildings are putting in requisitions and purchase orders as we speak. So I think we're still on target for what our projection was in terms
That was my question.
of where we were going to end up. But keep in mind, we'll be paying bills at least through the end of August, and our teacher compensation through the end of August is charged back to
Into this year.
into the 16-17 fiscal year.
Okay.
Okay?
Anybody have any questions on that?
Nope.
Okay, let's move on. Then the Citizen Advisory Committee, of which we have one in attendance. I was looking behind you.
You do have one?
Yes.
So let me just bring
So-
this up.
While you're pulling that up, Michelle, Patty, just to put you in the loop of something that was said in the public comment, at our policy committee meeting, we've been working on the field trip policy. And the question has come up a number of times that how are field trips funded, blah, blah, blah. So it was a time
We'll
when
put it on a future.
Well, there was a time you were out of the country, so I brought it to Susan's attention that we may need to look at it in the same way that we looked at supplementals.
Supplementals.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
no,
So I
that's
just
totally
wanted
fine.
you to know that that's where that comment from the public came.
Perfect.
So the Citizens Advisory Committee, if you'll recall, was formed, and back early in late winter, I guess, we started to meet, and they came to a Finance Committee meeting and gave a recommendation that we not enter into additional leases for iPads next year, but that the district take some time to review our technology. And we've currently started that process. And I've been talking with Mr. Batchelor, and I think he's spoken with some of you about some potential projects that the CAC could work on or take some time examining to help us determine where we should be focusing more of our time moving forward. So one of the areas is in district capital and planning. We thought that perhaps the CAC could review what we currently do, not do a big, broad overview to say, these are the projects that we think you should work on, but perhaps look at what we're doing in capital planning and give us some suggestions on how we could perhaps do that better and help us focus on looking at that in more depth,
So process.
a process.
Okay.
And then
Or system.
potentially having them help when we do that capital planning.
Okay.
Moving forward. And perhaps they'll look at what we do in capital planning and say, you know what, you guys are doing a great job on this. We don't really think you need to spend a lot more time.
Okay.
Certainly, we know there's always things we can improve upon. Another area that we talked about was looking at our contracted services. We do use a lot of contracted services, and we thought that the CAC could be helpful in helping us determine if we should focus more on some of those. We do have people on the CAC that come from various backgrounds, some of them from technology, some financial, and I think that they could be helpful in helping us look to make sure that we're not duplicating any of our contracted services. Another area is district real estate holdings and facility usage. We are going to talk about facility usage in the Facilities Committee meeting coming up, but we thought that we could at least utilize the CAC to help us look at those and determine if we should focus more on what our current holdings are and perhaps review how we're currently using them. Another area would be the National School Lunch Program. We currently participate in all of our buildings. We've had some schools around us that have opted out, at least at the high school level of the National School Lunch Program, and we thought the CAC could help with that. And trip funding is also on here. This may be an area that we don't necessarily need their assistance with if policy is currently working on that.
No, that's exactly the clarification, is that the policy committee
Booted it back.
does not believe that, we're looking at the policy of how the mechanics of field trips
Okay.
are conducted, not, there's no policies about how we fund things, just like we have no policies about how we fund supplementals. It's something that we have as a decision. It's part of our budget process. You all worked really hard with Susan and me to do the parameters of it. And it was that same, perhaps that same approach to how are field trips funded but it doesn't belong in policy. That component belongs in finance.
Okay, so these are some of the areas that administration has identified. We're certainly open to looking at other areas as well. The intent was not to have the CAC, again, look at all of these areas and come back with specific recommendations to the district, but to do a broad overview to say, you're doing a good job in this area, but you could use a little more assistance in this area, and this is where we really think that you should focus in this next year.
So the idea would be to put these 5 items, talk to the committee themselves, and so long as we agree these 5 items are up for grabs, if you will, that we're supporting having that committee do that, then they'd come back and kind of provide us some feedback, and you'd be working with them to identify where the heavy hitters would be. And
It would be a combination of a variety of administrators, depending on what areas they're looking at. Contracted services, that's going to be an area that covers operations and technology,
Sure.
curriculum, and the business office. It will cover a number of departments. So it won't just be myself, it'll be a variety of administrators that will be working on these projects. But during our discussion here, we may decide that these topics, these 5 topics, that might be too many, or it might be just the right amount. I'm not sure what anybody's thinking in terms of
what
that.
I'm trying to understand is, if we say, sure, these 5, we're okay with the subject matters. Nobody's got a concern about sending the committee off to do some work on any of the 5 of these. But we're not necessarily expecting that in the next X number of months, they're coming back on all 5.
Correct.
And also, keep in mind, we haven't completely finalized the goals and
this
so
came
forth
up
for next
through there.
year.
No,
And
this
has
came
come,
up through
yeah,
there.
and this has come up through there. And so, to the extent that there's other refinement that's coming from elsewhere, it might lengthen this list. So, in other words, these 5 are on it, but
Yeah,
it
well, we
might turn
just
into
need
7 or 8.
Or it might shorten it.
Well, right, I suppose.
So the idea being not just trying to throw spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Does anybody on this group have a problem with any of the 5 items that are on that list?
I don't have a problem with it, but I was wondering if the order, if they reviewed the school lunch program, would they be able to review it, get back to us, and have us not participate in time for the next school year?
I don't think so.
I believe that, and these items are not in any specific order.
Right.
The CAC is anxious to get started on additional projects. They're a group that is very enthusiastic. National School Lunch actually came up in one of our CAC meetings. That they may decide goes to the top of the list, but if they start looking at that now, their recommendation may be to the district, we think you should spend some time exploring whether or not it's financially feasible for you to opt out. They may not do all the work. They might do some of it, but not all of it. But I do believe if we wanted to have them look at that, they would be able to make a recommendation relatively quickly back to the district about whether or not we should participate in the following fiscal year. Not 17-18, it would
Right.
have to be 18-19.
So I don't have a problem with the 5 that are on this list. I am thinking about what Susan said about the fact that, some of this is coming up through the work we're doing at the board level about goals. And so I wouldn't want to have anybody on the committee be thinking, okay, good, this is the list, until it's really been fully vetted by the entire board, because this particular piece has been discussed at the board level in terms of, in the context of overall goal setting.
But these came from
These-
administration.
They did. They came from administration. It's my understanding that the board will be discussing goals very quickly, and so Mr. Batchelor wanted these presented to finance to make sure that everyone on the finance committee was in agreement that these were things that the CAC could potentially
Okay,
look at.
so now I'm just going to, so the rest of what I was going to say is that the only other piece about this I'm not completely clear about is that we never articulated kind of how long any people on the CAC were going to serve. And so without knowing, I mean, is it unending? And so without knowing, and we never did, I don't recall putting parameters around that. And so when you're talking about, at this point, just looking at these and giving us some initial feedback, and then perhaps from there, there's actual, one of these they actually delve into. And I know that you have, at least with the first project, kind of put a time frame around it, right, Michelle?
We have for the technology review.
Correct, right.
Correct.
So this is more a comment, less about the list. The list of things, I think these are, any one of these could be appropriate. So that's not my issue. My issue, or my concern, my thought, is more about the time frame of how long people are even serving on this committee, because we never articulated that when we formed it. So it's just hard for me to know, is it, if the same people would be involved or not involved, and if these end up being longer term look-ats. That's all. It's less
Well,
about,
the
it's not
reason we
list.
did that, right, was because there was consternation about us having a formalized committee of that elevated to that level of magnitude. And we wanted to keep this a little more fluid, if you will. That was by design, right? So I say, if there's nothing on this list that causes anybody on this committee agita, then let's allow the CAC, working with the appropriate administrative people, take a look at it and come back and make some recommendations, whether those recommendations are just a quick glance and no, that's not worth the time, or, hey, yeah, we think this one needs a little digger deeping, that's kind of new, deep digging, then fine, then they can come back and say that too. With regards to the structure of the committee, I mean, if anybody wants, I mean, that's, I guess, Michelle, you can have that conversation with the current members and see how they feel. If people are kind of tired of it, I know we've only kind of gotten them off the ground. I think they're pretty anxious to get started on something else. But if there's any kind of concern about continued participation or wanting to rotate off or whatever, you'll let us know.
Yeah, I'm not saying it because of that. I'm saying it because when I read agenda item number 3, Citizens Advisory, I had no idea what the context was. So over the weekend, I didn't know what we were going to be talking about with regard to this. And it was on my mind to say, hey, yes, when we formed this, we never did put any term limits, for lack of a better word. So I'm only mentioning it because this is the most recent time it's even on the agenda. And I didn't know what the context for why it was on today's agenda.
Okay.
So at the very least, I would like to get the CAC committee together again, just because we have not been able to give them as a group an update on the status of the technology project that the district is undertaking. And I think they would be interested to know what we've done so far, what our timeline is, and how we continue to move through this process. Certainly, this group has only had a couple of meetings. They did that project, the last project with technology, very quickly. And I do know that they would be happy to help with anything that they could help with that we determine is appropriate.
So at this point, since we don't have any specific budgetary constraints or timing constraints, these are all good, healthy projects for them to look at. We'll expect for that committee to kind of set their own pace on these, all, one or two of these items, and let's see what they say and come back and let us know.
Okay, I can do that.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. update on substitutes. So the big May date came and went.
It did,
And
and
our
we had
fear-
more absences, and we had a fill rate into the 80s, which was terrific, because last year, if you look at the third page, the fill rate, May of 2015, we were at 73, May of 16, we were down to 65, and May of 17, which is this year, we went up to 83, with additional absence of about 125.
How'd that happen?
How did the
How did
absence?
our fill rate, what, I'm just interested to understand, what happened that helped our fill rate be at that level? Was
We
there
put some additional, those additional building positions in, and things we've been talking about in
Yeah.
order to get a head start into May. We added those couple, and that helped. I mean, you can see the absences were higher, but our fill rate was higher, so we believe that has worked. We'd like to wait for June to come in, even though it was a short month, and then come back to the committee in August and see if we can replicate what we did last year. If we have the permission from this committee to do that again, then we could hopefully keep increasing fill rates.
So what would be helpful then is kind of on the fill rate page then maybe, is just to put some denotation about, whatever corrective actions or steps that we had taken.
Okay?
Adding the extra building specific
can
clubs
do
or
that.
whatever, just so that we, that the data has some
Not a problem.
points to it that help, reference points. And then, when we say next year and do the same thing, can you be more specific?
We'll list that out, yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's
Yeah,
what I
we'll
was
list
gonna
out
say.
as
So
far as
we'll-
having building subs, how many we had in each building, and those particulars.
And then I'd also, I guess, for the curriculum committee, not so much for our committee, but then talking about, which we said at curriculum, we were going to want to have that discussion there. I'd be interested just to hear what the thoughts are about from the training and the academic side, the curriculum side of having those subs in the buildings. What are the benefits of that? How are we training? We had a parent who asked a question about how we're bringing staff in and in such short order, training them up to be ready, transitioning them, not training, but transitioning them.
Yeah, I'll wait for Maureen to contact me, and then I'll see what she's looking for for her committee, and we'll try to make all that happen for August.
And then the discussion that we had previously with regards to why are our numbers so much higher this year? And I know we've kind of batted around that, and I know that we weren't able to really necessarily put our finger on the exact pulse, but
We've-
what do we think is happening? Because these numbers are striking. You can't just look at this and go, oh, there was a really bad
We
epidemic
have
of the
had
flu or something.
some extended illnesses
Uh-huh.
that more than we've had in previous years, especially in May. And that's just basically the teachers had the sick days or they didn't even have the sick days. It could have been without pay based on FMLA leave. So you have one person that's out the month of May, you're looking at 22, 23 days. So that can add it up. If we had 4 or 5, right, there's 100 days that you wouldn't necessarily have. So if I would have to commit now, we did have more of that. I do have my secretary who handles this trying to dig a little deeper to find out what some other causes may be.
I think we've heard some theories projected that perhaps it's because of a stress level or because it's perhaps because of, other organizational related things. Is there any evidence to provide
I do not have
information
any
on that?
evidence of that. no.
How are we doing with regards to getting feedback from our staff about just general happiness in their job? I mean, is there anything, I know that might sound silly, but if people are using their sick days because they'd just much rather not be here, or they're overstressed and they're using the sick days because of it, and it's because, we have too many kids in their class, or, we're giving them math and science all at the same time, and we're, new programs and we're stressing them out, how are we getting feedback from our staff?
Well, typically when a person retires from the district, they'll have an exit interview. If they so choose, we recommend it with me. And those are the things that I would ask, what are we doing well? What can we do to improve? Based on what I've heard so far this year, there's none of that in that. I can talk to the union leadership and get some ideas from them I don't know if I would ask particular teachers if they would come forward and say it, but through leadership, maybe I get some
It
information.
might be helpful just to put a feeler out or have the principals do it, just to get a sense. When you see trends like this, with numbers of that magnitude, we're not talking about
Right.
5, we're talking big numbers.
I mean, you just look at the January of numbers, and going back to the summary, 382 and 15, 374 and 16, 643 and 17.
Right, it's.
And February, again, 414, 375, 623. You know, March, 404, 372, 742. And yet April, it seems to level out.
We had spring break.
Yeah, you did have some
We had
time
spring
off that
break.
whole
but-
week of.
But enough to,
But it's a
enough
whole
to
week?
shift it. I mean, we have these multi-hundred days.
Well,
See,
keep in mind for
I would say
April's-
I would say April is the evidence that it is somewhat stress-related because people had a week of vacation, they decompressed.
Well, keep
But
in
I-
mind,
you know,
there
but I
was
don't know.
also
3
5
weeks.
less days they were working.
That's right, it's 3 weeks worth of
So,
measurements. So if you actually
really you
broke
have
this down by the number of
3
days in the
quarters
month,
definition.
it's proportionally the
Well,
same.
was it the same in 15 and 16? Was that our spring break, or were those in different?
I think
months.
Spring break
16
was in
April.
March, in 16, I think. End of March,
I would
beginning of
not know
April.
without looking
Yeah.
what it was.
Anyway.
All right.
But yeah, I'll contact RTA leadership and see if they can
You
give
know,
us some
and then the
insights
other
on that.
question is the building differential. If you look there on percentages, you know, Ithan is out, I guess, you know, 60% of the time that RES or WES is the big one, 14.2% there. I mean, those are just large numbers. You know, we talk about balancing our curriculum and trying to make sure our schools are equal. You know, a school that consistently has substantially higher absenteeism, you know, when does that start to become a problem?
Understood.
So again, that kind of comes back to what's going on in the building and the feedback from the principals, I think, and/or the union leadership, just to understand if there's anything. We don't need them to make it up. If they don't know, they don't know. But if there's, you know, any kind of information they can share with us, I think we'd be
We'll try to have
interested
that for you
understand.
for our next meeting.
Thank you.
That'd be brilliant, thanks. All right, does anybody have any other questions on said topic? So we'll talk about field trip guidelines, unless we've said that's a potential off for the Citizens Advisory Committee, so I don't know, Michelle, we'll have to talk about whether we're going to do it here as a part of this committee or wait to get something from them and then we'll pick it up from there. Other topics, other people? Anybody on this committee? Do you have any other topics that you have a burning need to have added to a future agenda?
Could we have Mr. Stitzel answer the sub-question that Mrs. Sherry asked about
Oh.
what determines whether or not a substitute is
not
needed
needed.
for a teacher or not needed for a teacher? So for example,
Thank you.
that substitute report, it says subs not needed.
Typically, if there is face-to-face contact with students, we would get a substitute in there. A guidance counselor, a coach, a reading specialist, those people that don't have the face-to-face on a consistent class period would not typically get
Okay,
subs filled in.
okay. And then internal coverage, does that count in there? So if somebody else can cover for the class?
If somebody else can cover, it would still be unfilled, the position, but we may use other teachers in order to slide into those
So that
classrooms.
could come up as part of the percentage fill rate, that if we're 83% filled, but teachers are filling in elsewhere,
could
we
be a
might
higher
get
rate.
to a 90%
Correct.
coverage.
And
Okay,
I don't know if we can, let me talk to the principals to see if there's even any way we could find out what they're doing.
Todd, I have a question about that. So, because one of the reasons that teachers might be absent, one of the categories is the, what's it called? School business. It's actually fairly significant, and I think we've had this conversation that there are, you know, IEP meetings or other school meetings that a teacher is required to be out of the classroom, so they need coverage. If you have I'm just curious from a count perspective how you do this. If you have a teacher who's absent for half the day for, say, IEP meetings, and you use one substitute person to cover two different teachers who might each be out half a day. So maybe you schedule some IEPs in the morning for one teacher and IEPs in the afternoon for the other, and use one. How does all that get counted?
It would be, each teacher would be out, but you'd have, the fill would cover them. So if you were out in the morning, that is one. If I'm out in the afternoon, that is one. But then we have fills, the same person may fill both, so that means two fills. So if there's
You
two
count it
absences,
one
there's
for
two
one.
fills.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, cool. Are we good? All right, I think that answered that question. Was there anything else? Anybody, any other topics? I guess if you don't have any off the top of your head, if you've got anything comes up to mind, please just send an email and we'll see if we can get it on the agenda for August, September. Excellent. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Thank you.
Public comment?
Oh, public comment. How dare I? How dare I? Sorry.
Just a quick question with the 5 suggestions for the CAC. And that is, I guess from the administration, will you try to prioritize these for the group, or will they come back with prioritizing them? How do you think that will work?
I think it depends a lot on the conversation at the board level regarding the goals. Unfortunately, Mr. Batchelor couldn't be here today. He and I have not spent a lot of time looking at those to determine the priorities or the priority order. He may have thought more about that and maybe presenting that to the board as a group, but I'm not exactly sure without speaking.
So
to him this week.
these may be connected then with the goals that will be for the next year, which that makes sense to me.
They may be connected to that, and whether or not they'll be prioritized, Judy, I can't answer that without his input.
Okay, thank you.
All righty. Now I'm going to call it quits. Okay. Thanks, guys.